and they're really good conversationalists. So oftentimes they find themselves in careers that allow them to talk and debate and exchange ideas for hours.
Like talk radio. I can almost see an ESTJ in talk radio loving that career.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we're talking about ESTJ careers, the ESTJ personality type in the Myers-Briggs system, and the careers that you as an ESTJ might want to go toward. Now, we're going to approach this in a very principled way today. And this whole conversation came up from our Personality Life Path mentorship group that we've been leading and guiding. So just so you know what I'm talking about, it's a mentorship group where we have a group of people come together over 8 weeks. Each week we look at one of the 8 Jungian cognitive functions. That's a lot of technical speak. We're not going to be that technical in this episode. Just this is for the setup of what we're going to talk about today. And we look at how that function's attuned to energy archetypically in the world and then to ourselves, our personality type. And we all use all 8 of these functions, but we prefer 2 of them. That's the course. That's the program that we're doing. But in the midst of it, we've noticed many people coming to this mentorship are in the midst of transition in their life. They're transitioning in their life in general, maybe relationship transition. They just broke up with a partner and they're figuring out what's next. Ton of people, though, Antonia, are coming into this program with a career transition frame. They're either just getting ready to start out on a new career, like maybe out of university, or they've been doing a career for a while and they want to make a change to their career trajectory. They don't know if this is the right career for them long-term into the future. And so they're exploring, many people are exploring this opportunity of saying, what else is there for me in the world, in life, in my career path? So today we want to talk about you as an ESTJ looking at your career trajectory, your career path through the lens of 4 different flavors of the ESTJ personality type. So Antonia, explain how we're going to actually look at this. You want to kick it off with the subtype concept?
Yeah, so we are borrowing some of this information from our friend Dr. Dario Nardi. We did a whole podcast episode talking about these subtypes and how they emerged, what the EEG scan wiring information is around them, and a bunch of other good, cool, tech geeky concepts. So my recommendation is if you're interested in doing a deeper dive, please feel free to go listen to that podcast. But this podcast episode is going to be for people who are both new to type. So if you've just discovered you're an ESTJ or you're, not that into the technical jargon of it, we want to make sure that this is accessible. And if you are super into type, then we also want to make sure that we have some of that technical piece in it. But effectively, these 4 different subtypes are ways that our type can manifest through nurture. Now, there's some evidence that indicates, or it seems at this time, that there's some evidence that indicates that our type is pre-wired. They've actually observed this with like extroverted versus introverted tendencies. So we suspect that type is nature, meaning that we're born with our personality type. But our subtype or our flavor or the variant of our type, that seems to be more influenced by nurture. And one of the biggest influences in our subtype is our career choice. And that makes sense, right? What we spend 40 hours a week plus doing is going to have a massive influence on how our brain wiring shows up, because those are the problems we're trying to solve. Those are the, that's the interfacing with the world. It's how we have to show up. And so there are 4 different subtypes or flavors of ESTJs that are both attracted to certain careers, and then if they choose those careers, are influenced by them to alter how that ESTJ personality type shows up.
So just like anything on the internet, if you're doing research about ESTJ careers, you're going to get a lot of general advice, stereotypes, and overgeneralizations. So I did some internet research, by the way, Antonia. I brought a top 10 list in my casual, cursory internet gathering through Google and other means. I have the top 10 list of ESTJ careers according to the internet. You ready for these? So here are the top 10 ESTJ careers according to the internet. Military officer or politician, corporate executive or manager, police officer / detective, lawyer or judge, financial analyst or accountant, engineer or architect, computer systems analyst or network administrator, sales manager or marketing director, human resources manager or recruiter. And then number 10 is teacher or educator. So that's a fairly good list. I think a lot of ESTJs could find themselves on that list, but there's a lot of ESTJs that say, I don't have any one of those careers. I don't feel like I'd want any of that. Am I really not an ESTJ?
Yeah.
Well, maybe just a different flavor ESTJ.
Yeah, there are some careers on that list that some ESTJ subtypes would hate, and that there are some careers that didn't make the list that are actually very much in alignment with certain ESTJ subtypes. So you want to kick it off?
Yeah, so let's talk a little about these. There's 4 flavors or subtypes of ESTJs. There's the dominant, creative, normalizing, and harmonizing subtypes. And as Antonia mentioned earlier, this comes from the work of Dr. Dario Nardi, who actually brought ESTJs into his laboratory, connected them to EEG machines, and watched brain scans and brain patterns show up on EEG brain scans over and over and over again. And so he built these patterns from this. The words are borrowed from socionics inventor Dr. Victor Galenko.
Not inventor. We got in trouble for saying inventor one time. But somebody who has put forth
the work, excuse me.
That's right, has forwarded socionics work and also talked about the subtypes.
Here I'm trying to give somebody credit, and I'm getting in trouble for that too.
Yeah.
It's crazy. If you don't give credit, you get in trouble. If you give credit, you get in trouble. Not trouble, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then also Dr. Helen Fisher's work with neurotransmitters.
Right.
So there's chemical, relationships to different chemicals in our brain that each of these have. Testosterone, estrogen, serotonin, and dopamine that we're going to talk about a little bit here. We're not going to go too much into that. I'll just give you a little bit of an index to that. So let's talk about the first subtype, dominant subtype, ESTJ dominant subtype. What does this look like?
So I think that this is sort of an archetypal, or excuse me, not archetypal. This is more of a stereotype of an ESTJ.
Yes.
When we think of ESTJs, a lot of times people automatically think of the dominant ESTJ. So some of the characteristics that come along with this subtype is that they're active, ambitious, decisive, outgoing, practical. They work hard, and they are usually navigating their way towards at least responsibility, if not power. All right. And there is a poise that comes along with this ESTJ. They're usually pretty good at sort of showing up the way that they need to show up in order to make happen what they want to make happen. The brain wiring that is unique to them is really good about putting ideas into action. That's a big piece of the dominant version. And they do things like talk and walk on the go. All right. So they're constantly in motion, constantly working, constantly getting things done. And when they communicate, they do it with a focus on goals. All right. So everything is about implementation and getting into action. So what ends up being just sort of their the unsurprising list of careers that are good for them.
I already can see it in my mind.
Yep. Leaders, business owners, independent consultants, public speakers. If they go towards business or community work, it's going to look like a background in accounting, human resources, marketing, medicine, statistics. But Dario makes sure to articulate or clarify that these are not analysts, right? They don't have the patience for technical work. And so they might have a background in learning some of these things, but they're not going to take it into their careers, if they want to stay a dominant subtype. It's not fast enough. And so, like you mentioned, the list of careers, there were a couple of them on there that I'm like, I don't think a dominant subtype could do that career because it would require too much patience. So this is a subtype that is, very assertive, very on the go, and doesn't really like to have to slow down too much.
Probably is very good at delegation and directing energies and resource and people to create an actual goal in the world, like to make something happen as an outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're very efficient. They're very tapped into group dynamics. The challenge is that they're not terribly sensitive to feelings. And so again, this is sort of when people think of ESTJs, a lot of times they think of a dominant ESTJ who's insensitive. But even when a dominant ESTJ does some inner work, right, they balance their inner world and their outer world, they actually can be quite inspiring. They don't have to be insensitive to feelings. It's just if they're young, that tends to be one of the challenges.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked about some of the jobs. Let's talk a little bit about the geekiness part, like for the type geeks that are listening along. This is associated with the chemical of testosterone more than the other subtypes, and in the neurotransmitter way. What is the attunement of the cognitive function level for this? The cognitive functions ESTJs are using. The dominant driver function is extroverted thinking, effectiveness. That's how they make their best decisions. And ESTJs learn information or perceive the world through their co-pilot, auxiliary is the technical name, of introverted sensing. We call it memory. So what attunement do these two functions have when we're talking about the dominant?
Okay, so for the type geeks out there, each of the functions can have an either what's called analytic bent or a holistic bent. And think of this as basically input-output, and or a desire to sort of assert your energy to the outside world or to use it to understand things or sort of receive information from the outside world. And for the dominant subtype, they have an analytic bent on both of those functions.
That's different than judging or perceiving, though.
Exactly.
Because it almost sounded like that's what you're explaining.
Yeah, no, this is not about introversion or extroversion. This is not about judging and perceiving. This is just every single cognitive function has the capacity to receive and to assert. Almost
like a focus, like really point focused or more diffused focused,
right.
Wide field versus very specific, like sniper versus shotgun.
Exactly. It's like, am I more sort of open to information out here, or am I more, do I have my blinders on and I've got a more of assertive, yeah, exactly, like a sniper way of looking at it. And for dominant ESTJs, both of their preferred functions, both introverted sensing, memory, and extroverted thinking, effectiveness, reverse order of preference, by the way, both of those functions have a more sniper, sort of blinders on, but directive, assertive energy to them.
Okay. And so you can clearly see the reason why this ESTJ is the stereotype online. You probably have worked for one of these ESTJs at some point in your life. In your career, even if you are an ESTJ listening along, you probably have worked for another ESTJ of this persuasion, of this flavor, because they tend to end up in management or leadership. And so you'll probably have a memory, oh yeah, I know what an ESTJ is. That I used to have a boss that was an ESTJ, or somebody that I knew in my past career or something like that, or maybe you work with one right now. So I think this is why it's such a common stereotype.
Yeah, and there's a lot of flexibility, actually, interestingly enough. Even though there is a dominant energy, they're really good at being whatever the context requires them to be, right? Like quickly, asking a question, getting information, and then sort of quickly navigating based on the answer they get. And so you do see these ESTJs in a lot of different fields because they do the job. Yeah, they do what needs to be done.
Awesome. Okay, so that's dominant. Let's talk about the second subtype, creative subtype of ESTJ.
Okay, so this is the far less common subtype of ESTJ. In fact, I suspect that a lot of ESTJs of this subtype mistype as perceivers, possibly even as feelers, maybe intuitives. This is a subtype that we don't usually think of when we think of ESTJs. So some of the characteristics are that they're astute, engaging, expressive, inclusive, inventive, and really interested in learning and new ideas. All right, so they love taking in as much information as they can. And this is very common with creative subtypes, by the way. They're just lifelong learners. They are usually witty. They usually have surprise outside-the-box ideas. They are more adaptable than the other ESTJ subtypes. So there's a strong or high adaptability to them. Now, this is a little bit different than the ability to adapt to a work context like the dominant ESTJ that just goes in, figures out what needs to, be done, and then do it. This is more of like a lifestyle of adaptability. This is not just with a goal focus, but it's kind of an open-endedness, which is why I suspect that a lot of them think that they are perceivers. They are goal-focused. It's just short-term goals. So they don't have as long-term goals like responsibility and power.
Yeah.
This is more like short goals on the way to something.
Tactical goals.
Yeah, a little more, because they have more of an open-endedness to them. So they're not setting long-term goals as much because they don't want to be stuck doing those long-term things necessarily.
So maybe this ESTJ, whereas the dominant might be starting a business or starting some kind of a entity, a startup, and they want to create that startup and sell it or create a great product out of it. This creative style might be more focused on the actual product development or a certain project or that movie they're going to create or whatever it is it's still a goal, but it's got an end point. It doesn't just keep going on forever, like maintenance-wise.
You got it. In fact, that's exactly it. For creative subtypes, because all of the types have a creative version, this is the creative subtype that's much better at execution than other subtype or other types, right? Like if we start talking about like say ENFP creative subtypes, or we just talked about INFJ creative subtypes in a previous podcast, they struggle with the day-to-day. ESTJ creatives don't as much struggle with the day-to-day. They have better executive skills, but they are going to be a little bit more about product design and that sort of thing. They're more open-ended and a little bit more exploratory. So they take on careers and roles that require them to sort of be connected to whatever's new, right? Which is why they have that open-endedness. So things that are a lot about self-education, but also like what are the new technologies? What are the new advances? What are the new things that are coming out? And how can I put this into my product design? How can I put it into, something that is artistic? And there's a real tapping in to art appreciation, cultural exchange, people watching, things like that, like softer things that we don't usually associate with ESTJs. They're more tuned into those kinds of components, and they're really good conversationalists. So oftentimes they find themselves in careers that allow them to talk and debate and exchange ideas for hours.
Like talk radio. I can almost see an ESTJ in talk radio loving that career.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So this is going to be an ESTJ with a gift for gab. Yeah. But you're also going to see them in things like visual design, maybe a tattoo artist. We know somebody who we suspect is a creative ESTJ who is a dueling pianist and a performer. And it's really interesting that our friend, he repeatedly says, I'm not an artist, I'm a performer. And we're always like, no, you're an artist too. And it's like, no, I'm a performer. And it's like, for some reason, he doesn't really want to take on the moniker of artist, even though he's been doing it for decades, is incredible and writes his own music. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah. They can be a little more scattered than other ESTJs, meaning that they're more likely to have jumped from job to job than other ESTJs. They can also be a little rebellious, right? They might have a sort of a cause they believe in, and they're a bit of a rabble rouser for it. They have a bit of a tricky sense of humor and a capacity to play with people. And so that can come out. And so they're tuned into people, and they're actually usually pretty charming. But it's they also can use that capacity to read people to kind of mess with the environment.
Yeah. Okay. So this style of ESTJ is probably going to benefit from platform thinking. I've been noticing a pattern as we talk about all the different types and we talk about the creative subtype. Platforms are really important. What do I mean by platform? So if you're a creative ESTJ, you're probably not going to want to file all the paperwork or do all the procedural things that we would think of maybe an ESTJ would have an aptitude for. You probably can do it, but it's probably not your like go-to thing that you want to do. So for example, if you're a creative person, finding a platform, you're a video creator, ESTJ, getting on a platform like YouTube enables you to just focus on your creation, your art, your performance, the thing you're putting out there, the project itself, the product design, rather than all the infrastructure to support the product design. You let somebody else handle that. You let the platform itself handle that. Right. So careers here for creative, I mean, anything from getting on YouTube, I would even argue maybe being like an Uber driver, because now it gives you more of it pays the bills on your schedule. You don't have to show up to an office necessarily, and you get to be more dynamic in the way you come to the world. And now maybe your creative outlet isn't what you get paid for, but it's subsidized by something like driving for Uber or another platform, thinking type job.
Right. And chat with people.
Exactly.
Right. All day. And I actually said that they're charming. Actually, the word should be engaging, because there is actually a component to them that is a little rebellious, as I mentioned, rabble rouser. There's like a rebelliousness and maybe even a little insensitivity, which is that capacity to play with people. But at the same time, that's really needed when, what is the phrase? Well-behaved women rarely make history. Yeah. Well-behaved ESTJs don't make history either. So there's a bit of the not being the well-behaved ESTJ. And that there are certain businesses that really need that, that ability to execute, goal orientation, even short term, but also that ability to kind of shake things up a little. Yeah,
and I can see also like an ESTJ that's a creative, wired ESTJ doing well someplace in Hollywood, the recording, music industry, where there's some management needed, but also some creativity in combination with the management. You need a little bit of management, but a little bit of creativity, and you're kind of bridging both worlds.
Yeah, it's bringing a business mindset to art.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or at least I would say a resource mind art. I guess business. You could call it business.
Yeah.
So this creative subtype then chemically, like the neurotransmitters focused on the chemical of dopamine. And so dopamine's important. That's a relationship with dopamine. What is the function attunement here?
So for the creative subtype, for those of you who are more into geeky stuff, the judging function of extroverted thinking, we call it effectiveness, is going to have more of a holistic flavor to it. So that's going to be the more open-ended, which is why there's not as much of an insistence of getting things done. And the goal orientation is a little shorter, right? Because the executive extroverted thinking part of them is a little bit more diffused, a little bit more open-ended, a little more receptive. The perceiving function, in this case, introverted sensing, or what we call memory, that's going to have an analytic bent to it. That's going to be the more assertive, sort of more of a desire to get its appetites of learning fed, right? And that's why they're lifelong learners. And one of the reasons why, it's important to them to find career paths that allow them to be what you would call autodidactical, which is constantly, perpetually learning new information.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked about the dominant, creative. We still have the normalizing and harmonizing left. Let's go to normalizing. ESTJs can express this way. How does an ESTJ express in a normalizing subtype?
All right. So this will be one of the other subtypes that sounds a little more stereotypically ESTJ. Although I do suspect that some of these ESTJs might mistype as ISTJs because there's a little bit more of an introverted sort of quality to them. So some of the characteristics are that they are particularly conscientious, they're detail-oriented, dutiful, objective, and strict. They work hard, they follow procedures, and they aim to set a good example. So these are like the conscientious, good citizen ESTJs. Because of how their brain wiring shows up, they think very sequentially. They like to connect a few dots at a time in order to make a bigger picture. They are focused in on accurate speech, mental planning, operating procedures, social rules, right? This is more of what we think of or a lot of people, not we, but a lot of people think of ESTJs as being a little bit more sort of dialed in this way. And then at the same time, they like to be a part of something larger than themselves. So they have a tendency to be attracted to institutions, to big organizations. They fill jobs that require a mixture of administrative and technical skills. So they are more likely to be an analyst than, say, the dominant ESTJ because they have the patience for it. They're a more patient ESTJ type. So they do really well in school. And they're usually interested in things like economics, finance, history, law enforcement. That was one of the things that ended up on your list that I was like, a creative subtype would hate that, but a normalizing would love it. They usually are versed in logistical and technical elements, and they might even be attracted to things like laboratories, right? Yeah. And to do experience in labs. And they really like knowing the ins and outs of supplies, tools, methods, whatever helps them get the job done in their area. And they have the patience for that. They're not just looking at things that are really efficient like an ESTJ would. This is more about craftsmanship the dominant ESTJ. So it's less about just being efficient like the dominant subtype. This is more about the craftsmanship of getting things done.
Yeah, and so playing nice with institutions, this is probably the ESTJ that's most likely able to be comfortable getting the 9-to-5 job, working there maybe for a few decades, or at least a period of time, building career capital, maybe at one or just a few companies, perfecting their resume, perfecting the skill set. Also, probably this ESTJ is tapped into institutional knowledge the most of all of the subtypes, I would argue. Like really understands like, okay, I've been here for 10 years. This is how this organization operates. This is the institutional way we do things, the standards and the procedures and all of that. They're probably going to be very attuned to that more than the others. It probably matters to them more.
Yeah. Yeah. They're more tuned into things like heritage.
Yeah.
And they're more likely to have a religious tone, right? Or philosophical tone. And the challenge is that they can come across a little bottled up, right? Unexpressive, but they are very responsible to their communities, and that means something to them.
Yeah. So if you find yourself leaning more toward this, you probably are either already in a career that lends itself this way, or maybe this is the career you want to be, leaning toward. Maybe you're in something that doesn't serve this well. I think the world is set up to accommodate normalizing subtypes a lot. There's a lot of opportunities for people that identify with normalizing flavors of subtype, and I would say ESTJ is perfectly in alignment with that. From a technical geek standpoint, this is going to be associated with the chemical of serotonin, neurotransmitter. And then let's talk about the function attunement for normalizing.
Right. So for the tech geeks, this is you take the perceiving function. It's the opposite of the creative subtype. The perceiving function is the function that has a more holistic bent. It's more receptive. And this is why it takes in information from the community. Like, how should I be seeing things? It's a little bit more diffused and open to information. But then the judging function, in this case, extroverted thinking, what we call effectiveness, that's going to have the analytic bent. So that's going to be the more make things happen. It's going to be sort of focused on how things should be running, and more loyal to that idea of setting things up and making it run the way it should be run.
Okay. So let's talk about the final subtype for ESTJs, the harmonizing subtype. So we've talked about the dominant, creative, normalizing. The fourth is harmonizing.
All right. So this is going to be the least looking like an ESTJ in a lot of people's minds if you're focused on stereotypes. So this is an ESTJ that usually emerges later on in life. Not always. Sometimes you can see somebody who's been encouraged to be the harmonizing version young, but most of the time when you run into a harmonizing ESTJ, this is somebody who's more seasoned and later on in life. So some of the characteristics is that they're especially personable for an ESTJ. They're more thoughtful. They have usually a little bit more of a sophisticated way of looking at things. They're more multifaceted. They're taking in sort of more perspectives and more points of view. They are charming. I mentioned how the creative is going to be engaging, but maybe not so charming, right? This is going to be a very charming ESTJ. And they create room for other people, right? They're they're an ESTJ that makes space for others, while at the same time being very encouraging to other people's growth. So based on the mind wiring, I'm not going to go into all of the different technical aspects, but based on their mind wiring, they are very balanced with the technical, the artistic, and the people-oriented sides of themselves. They kind of marry it all together. And because of that, they end up being focused on others as unique individuals, but they keep the practical needs of those people in mind. They tend to have more of an aesthetic orientation, like both in the details being accurate, but also in sort of just like a general aesthetic sense, right, with beauty and that sort of thing. So almost like they get a little bit of that artistic flavor from the creative side. But they also still have pretty good executive skills because they still are ESTJs, so they're pretty good at making decisions. In fact, considering that they're a harmonizing subtype, they're one of the best harmonizing, because there's subtypes of all of the 16 types. For harmonizing subtypes, they're the best at decision making.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that speaks to an ESTJ is an ESTJ
right.
in capacity.
Yeah.
Like, again, we're not saying that these subtypes are a new personality type. We're saying that the ESTJ still has the ability to set goals, accomplish things, manage resource in the outer world. It's just the harmonizing ESTJ is going to be a little less focused on that. Like, they're not going to be putting that forward as the driver of their life. They still have capacity for it. It just doesn't mean that's going to how they show up in the world initially.
Yeah. Well, and it's all relative compared to the other subtypes, right?
Yes.
So we talked I can't remember which subtype it was, possibly INFJ, but it was like these INFJs are way better at keeping themselves going, but it's like in comparison to other INFJs, right?
Yeah.
And so this is a comparison to the other ESTJ subtypes. Are going to be more sort of humanist oriented. And part of the reason why is because they've learned to not take life too seriously beyond the essentials, right? Like if I've got the things, my responsibilities handled, then, there's a little bit more of like a sort of philosophical, let things happen.
Yeah.
And that gives them a unique flavoring for the subtype. So as mentioned, they're balancing technical, artistic, and people-oriented skills. And so they end up focusing on individual people, particularly seeing them as opportunities for growth and what is the potential of this person. And like all harmonizing subtypes, they tend to prefer to work one-to-one. So typical roles are things like adult educator, diplomat, customer relations officer, media producer, skills coach, teen counselor, salesperson, social worker, and talent manager. So again, you're looking at a person with an eye towards effectively what is this person's best potential, so that can either go in talent scouting to put them in a position or to directly coach or mentor that person in order to help them become that best version. They are usually more discerning than other ESTJ subtypes, and they oftentimes have like a multicultural outlook. So the reason why this is more common in older ESTJs is because of travel. Right?
Yeah.
If they've done a lot of world travel, that's something that can lend itself to becoming one of this subtype. And they're focused on quality, right? They're really good at recognizing quality products, people, experiences, and that becomes a focal point for them. And they oftentimes have a bit of a spiritual streak, right? Not as religious as maybe the normalizing, but this is more of a philosophical, spiritual capacity.
So as you're talking, I'm identifying, I think my grandmother on my mom's side was a harmonizing ESTJ. She actually worked, she had like a master's degree in counseling. She ended up as a college or university advisor to students, and she was in counseling, like helping counsel people for her career. And I think that she did very well in that. One of the things she struggled with was boundary setting. Like she really struggled with boundaries. In other words, well, actually my experience of her was she would get butthurt about people crossing boundaries she didn't even know if she had.
Right.
And then she'd be offended by it and like have a bad mood for periods of days because she wasn't good at asserting the boundaries until it was too late. So I think that's just something I'm commenting on it through my experience to say, if you're this style of ESTJ, that might also be a challenge for you. I don't know. Maybe it's just unique to her. I don't know. But I've seen an ESTJ show up like this, and I would say that she probably doesn't fit the stereotypes of ESTJs. In how she showed up the world. So I think you're right that the stereotypes don't typically match the harmonizing as much.
Yeah, actually Dario mentions that the subtype has a sacrificial streak. And so
martyr, maybe?
Well, I mean, again,
that's how she showed up with it a lot.
If it's well earned and seasoned and mature, I'm sure it's like a willingness to sacrifice. If it doesn't, because we're all stratified, if it's
less
coupled
mature
with a less mature, it might look martyrish.
Yeah. Neurotransmitter, this is associated with estrogen. Mm-hmm. And let's talk about the attunement of the functions.
Right. So this would be the opposite of the dominant. So both the perceiving and the judging function would be holistic. It would be more diffused, open, and receptive.
Okay. Fantastic. So again, we're not talking about 4 different personality types. Imagine the ESTJ personality is a song with musical notes on a piece of paper, and the performance of that song, there's 4 different ways to perform that same song. Those are the subtypes. That's the flavor that you're performing out as an ESTJ. You are an ESTJ. That's how your cognition works. This is just the flavoring that you show up with that lends itself to a career path. And what's weird or interesting about this is both maybe the way you show up as your subtype can influence the aptitude or the desire for a career path, but the career that you choose can also influence your subtype. In other words, you could start off more as a dominant, but you get into a job or a career that's more normalizing. It's going to start to shape you as an ESTJ to being more like a normalizing ESTJ. So this means the context you put yourself in will express, it'll change how you express yourself, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Exactly. And I think that's important to remember. I know that Dario said that he was really reluctant to call these subtypes initially. He wanted to call them like variants, but that word ended up being associated with something else. But I also like to think of them as flavors. this is something that is, again, nurture oriented. So if you want to, if you want to be more of a creative subtype, then you can put yourself in the context of, those kinds of jobs or positions, and it might awaken that subtype energy. Arguably, one of the goals, if you look at it through the lens of being an adaptable creature in a universe that is unkind to creatures that lack awareness and adaptability, one of the goals, at least I have for myself, is to be able to match the context with the subtype that is right for that context, meaning that I have enough ability to go through these different flavors that I can call upon the one that's needed in the moment. Now, I'm not there yet. I'm still working on, for me, it's the dominant, ENTP subtype. I'm trying to figure that piece out because I'm more harmonizing. But we can put ourselves in different career paths that bring out these different components, or we can choose a career that suits where we're already at, and that's perfectly fine too.
Yeah. Okay. And then the maturation process of your life matters as well. Like different times in life, we might need to lean into one of these energies over the other. So as you're thinking about your career as an ESTJ, I think it'd be interesting to identify with one of these subtypes. And then just ask yourself, am I already in a career, or am I looking toward a career that really lends itself to the way I naturally show up? And if I'm going toward a career that's not my natural subtype, am I okay with that career shaping me over time to be a different subtype?
Right. You had mentioned before that people are at transition points. Sometimes it's because they're in a career that doesn't suit their type or their subtype, and they've got to find one that matches them more. Or they have a career that perfectly matches their subtype, but they're feeling limited, right? They're feeling like they're hitting the law of diminishing returns on that, and they're looking for something adjacent to it. So I think that's why careers aren't a simple conversation, right? It's not a one-to-one match. It's more about the time period in your life, and right, are you ready for a career to help shape who you are? Maybe that's another question a person could ask. Not just are you willing, but are you ready? Right? If that's that might be something you are desiring. And as an ESTJ, you want to become shaped by your career path. Or maybe it's time to find one that's better suited to your subtype so you can kind of relax into it for a little while and not have to constantly be sort of, pushing upstream.
Yeah. And also this explains why you may not resonate with recommendations online for career choices. You're like, it doesn't fit me. But they say that's good for ESTJs. I guess I'll just accept it because the list on the internet says so. So
yeah,
I guess that's what I'll do. Like, you don't have to do that.
Well, and you can tell that some of these variants or subtypes or flavors could have been mistyped as well. Like I said, the normalizing might be mistyping as an ISTJ. The creative might be mistyping as a perceiver or a feeler. The harmonizing could be mistyping as an intuitive or as a feeler. So it's not uncommon that we're in the wrong place also because we don't have our best fit type nailed down yet either.
All right. So if you're an ESTJ that's been listening or watching along, we want you to come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your career story with us and the community. We'd love to get a conversation going around this. What is your career through line? Are you just starting out? Maybe you're in university or ready to embark on your new career. Maybe you've been in it for a while. Maybe you've been in a career for decades and you've really identified with one of these subtypes and you're like, yeah, I'm definitely that. And this is the career that's tailored for me. I feel perfect in this career choice, this job. It just speaks to me. Or maybe you're like some of the people in our personality life path mentorship and you're reevaluating.
Change.
You're like, this is not fitting me anymore. I want to do something different, but I don't know what to do because I've done this so long. Where can I go? And maybe leaning into one of these other subtype energies is the pathway for you to start to unlock opportunity for yourself. Come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
Yeah, we'll also put a link for Dario's work. At this time, he's created a booklet that talks about these subtypes and some of the information around them. So we'll make sure to have a link so you can go check out that information if you're interested. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. Helps me out a lot too because I get a little bit of feedback and we know how we're doing. So please also leave a review with your rating. You might be watching us on YouTube right now because the podcast is now available in video platform. So come watch us on YouTube, Personality Hacker, and you can also leave a comment there. You can indicate you enjoyed this episode by liking it, and you can subscribe to us there and click the little bell that lets you know when a new episode is up. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, it also helps us out a lot. And finally, if you are trying to figure out your best fit type, maybe listening to this episode got you all confused and you're like, am I actually an ESTJ? You can head over to personalityhacker.com and take our free online assessment and at least have it be part of your discovering your best fit type journey, right? It might be the launching pad you need or the beginning of a journey, or maybe it finally confirms what you were thinking the whole time. So head over to personalityhacker.com, take that free assessment.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.